The phrase doesn't trigger panic. It triggers recognition. Frozen on purpose doesn't sound like loss to you. It sounds like delay with intent. You've felt this pattern before, long before it had language. Moments when momentum stalled just as something significant was within reach. Access paused. Progress slowed. Doors didn't close, they locked. And you sensed, even then, that this wasn't sabotage. It was containment. You've lived with an unusual relationship to power. Not the visible kind, status, authority, attention, but the quiet kind that accumulates when you don't spend yourself recklessly. You've noticed how easily others burn through opportunities the moment they're granted. How quickly influence evaporates when it's rushed, flaunted, or poorly timed. You didn't move that way. You held back, often without fully knowing why. Instinct told you that exposure before readiness would dilute what you carried. The idea of royal assets here is symbolic. It's not money or titles. It's leverage, access, timing. Capacities that compound when protected and collapse when misused. Somewhere along the way, something you were meant to inherit, responsibility, reach, authority over outcomes, was intentionally restricted. Not removed. Preserved. You weren't denied. You were deferred. You may remember seasons where effort didn't translate into reward the way it should have. Where competence went unnoticed. Where your restraint was mistaken for passivity. You watched others advance faster by spending loudly, aligning quickly, or conforming publicly. You could have done the same. You didn't. Not because you lacked ambition, but because something in you resisted premature release. You sensed that what you were building couldn't survive early exposure. Freezing in systems that understand longevity is not punishment. It's preservation. It prevents decay. It buys time. It ensures that when something is finally released, it arrives intact. You may not have had proof of this at the time. All you had was a quiet refusal to force what wasn't ready. That refusal felt costly. It required patience without guarantees, endurance without applause. There were moments when doubt crept in, when you wondered if you were being overly cautious, overly restrained, overly patient, when stillness felt indistinguishable from stagnation. But even then, something deeper held. You didn't fracture. You didn't sell pieces of yourself for speed. You waited, not idly, but attentively, learning how to hold capacity without needing to spend it. The symbolism of assets being frozen points to something precise. Your value was too concentrated to be left unguarded, too consequential to be released into unstable conditions. You weren't slowed because you were weak. You were slowed because the environment wasn't ready to handle what you could move once fully activated. This reframes everything that once felt unfair. The pauses, the delays, the sense that your trajectory was being managed by forces you couldn't see. It wasn't control for its own sake. It was timing. Someone, or something, understood that premature power corrupts even the well-intentioned. And now, as this idea lands, another realization begins to surface quietly. Freezes are not permanent states. They are conditions, and conditions change. What was preserved has a release window. And the story of why it had to be frozen begins here. When something valuable is frozen, it isn't forgotten. It's monitored, checked, protected from the very pressures that would distort it if released too early. You may begin to see how often your life mirrored this logic. Opportunities hovered, then withdrew. Access appeared, then stalled. People recognized your capability, then hesitated to fully engage it. This pattern wasn't random. It followed a rule set designed for assets that can't afford depreciation. You learned early how to function without immediate reinforcement, how to build capacity in silence, how to strengthen decision-making without external reward. While others relied on momentum to stay motivated, you learned to rely on structure. This made your growth less visible, but far more durable. You didn't peak early. You consolidated. And consolidation is invisible until it isn't. There were moments when you felt underestimated. Not dismissed, misread. Your restraint was taken as lack of hunger. Your patience as lack of urgency. Your refusal to overextend as absence of ambition. You saw this clearly. You chose not to correct it. Because correction would have required revealing what wasn't meant to be spent yet. You protected your leverage by staying unreadable. This is the quiet discipline that separates those who inherit power from those who merely touch it. Power doesn't fail because it's strong. It fails because it's exposed before its holder understands timing. You were being trained in timing long before you knew that was the lesson. Every delay sharpened your sense of consequence. Every pause taught you how to wait without weakening. You may remember moments when you were close to forcing movement, when frustration tempted you to push doors that were resisting. Something stopped you. Not fear, calibration. You sensed that movement achieved through pressure would demand repayment later. So you held. You let conditions reveal themselves. You allowed misalignment to disqualify itself without confrontation. The freeze wasn't only external. Part of it happened internally. You learned how to restrain impulses, how to observe desire without immediately acting on it, how to carry potential without needing to prove it. This internal freezing preserved clarity. It kept your judgment from being hijacked by urgency or envy. It allowed you to see long arcs instead of short wins. As time passed, something subtle happened. What felt like restriction became preparation. You noticed that when others were overwhelmed by access, you remained composed. When others rushed authority, you evaluated it. You developed a tolerance for responsibility that didn't excite you, but didn't scare you either. That neutrality is rare, and it's what allows real leverage to be trusted. Now, as you look back, the pattern sharpens. The freeze didn't protect you from failure. It protected what you could move once fully activated. It ensured that when release came, you wouldn't confuse access with identity or power with worth. This is where the story deepens. Preservation is never the end goal. It's a phase, a necessary one. And phases always have conditions for transition. The next phase doesn't ask whether you're capable. It asks whether the environment is finally stable enough to receive you. Stability isn't declared, it's demonstrated. You begin to recognize the signs when it appears. Systems stop rushing, people stop posturing, decisions stop being made to impress invisible audiences. The environment grows quieter, not because it's empty, but because it's ready. This is when frozen assets become relevant again. Not as promise, but as possibility. You may have noticed that your own posture has shifted in anticipation of nothing in particular. You're not preparing for a reveal. You're not waiting for permission. You're simply available in a way you weren't before. Available without being exposed. Present without being spent. That difference matters. It means the freeze did its work internally before anything external could change. This is also when you see how carefully your path avoided shortcut. There were moments where leverage could have been converted early, attention gained, authority claimed, influence accelerated. You passed on them, sometimes consciously, sometimes instinctively. At the time, it felt like restraint. Now it reads as protection. Shortcuts would have entangled you in obligations that dilute long-term control. You weren't avoiding risk. You were avoiding erosion. As conditions normalize, you sense new forms of access appearing, not louder, but cleaner. Conversations are more direct. Invitations are more specific. Expectations are more realistic. There's less theater and more substance. This is the environment frozen assets wait for. Not because it's perfect, but because it can hold weight without collapsing. You might feel a subtle readiness to engage that isn't fueled by hunger. It's fueled by accuracy. You know what you're willing to move now, and what you still won't. That discernment is the true dividend of the freeze. You don't spend capacity reflexively. You deploy it intentionally. Power, once learned, stops being exciting and starts being exact. This phase also brings clarity about why some relationships never fully materialized, why alliances stayed informal, why support came indirectly. Formalization too early would have locked you into structures that weren't built to last. You were kept flexible while others became fixed. Flexibility isn't weakness when it's paired with structure. It's leverage waiting for alignment. As you stand here, nothing dramatic happens. That's the signal. Releases that matter don't announce themselves. They integrate. You begin to move naturally into spaces that match your pace. You don't have to assert relevance. It's already assumed. The environment adjusts because it can sense what you won't waste. This is when the freeze begins to thaw, not all at once, not publicly, not performatively. Piece by piece. Capacity by capacity. Only what can be held is released. Only what can be stewarded is activated. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click Super Thank You, and sow a gift of $20 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building His kingdom. Let His overflow pour through you. And as this unfolds, one truth becomes unavoidable. The delay was never about withholding from you. It was about withholding you from instability. When the thaw begins, it doesn't feel like acceleration. It feels like traction. Movements require less force. Decisions meet less resistance. What once needed explanation now lands with minimal effort. This is how you know the freeze is lifting for the right reasons. Not because urgency returned, but because friction reduced without compromise. You may notice that your tolerance for noise has dropped sharply. Not irritation, clarity. You no longer negotiate with distraction or justify restraint. You recognize when something asks for access without offering stability in return, and you decline without drama. This isn't selectiveness for comfort. It's stewardship. You understand now that every release creates responsibility, and you're unwilling to hand responsibility to environments that can't carry it. The symbolism of royalty matters here. Royal assets aren't liquid by default, they're safeguarded. They're released with protocol, timing, and intent. You were trained in protocol through delay. You learned to separate desire from deployment, opportunity from obligation. That separation kept you sovereign when others became indebted to momentum they couldn't sustain. You may feel a quiet confidence in your posture now. Not pride, not anticipation, but readiness without hunger. You're not eager to prove anything. You're prepared to act when alignment presents itself. That readiness is what systems recognize first. They don't test your enthusiasm. They test your restraint. They watch whether you'll overspend yourself for access. You don't. This is also where boundaries become cleaner. You don't explain them. You embody them. People sense where to stop without being told. Offers arrive more clearly defined. Roles come with fewer hidden costs. That's not luck. That's what happens when leverage is preserved long enough to set terms rather than accept them. You might reflect on earlier versions of yourself who mistook stillness for stagnation. You see now that stillness was structural. It allowed weak incentives to fall away on their own. It prevented you from being shaped by short-term gain. It kept your judgment unclouded while the landscape rearranged itself. That rearrangement wasn't visible then. It is now. As traction replaces tension, another shift occurs internally. You stop scanning for release signals. You trust that when something is meant to move, it will move without coercion. This trust isn't naive. It's informed by pattern. Every time you waited, conditions eventually revealed why. That history builds confidence without bravado. The freeze taught you how to hold power without spending it. The thaw teaches you how to move it without losing yourself. These are different skills. Few people learn both. Fewer still learn them in the correct order. The story continues not toward spectacle, but toward precision. What releases next will not be everything at once. It will be exactly what can be carried without compromise. And that selectivity is the final proof that the freeze served its purpose. Precision changes how you perceive opportunity. You no longer see openings as chances to expand indiscriminately, but as invitations that must earn engagement. This shift isn't defensive, it's sovereign. You've learned that access without structure becomes liability, and that restraint preserves optionality. Where others rush to convert possibility into motion, you allow possibility to clarify itself first. You may notice how your decisions now feel quieter. Not smaller, cleaner. You don't stack commitments. You sequence them. You don't chase momentum. You establish cadence. This allows you to move with intention rather than reaction, and it makes your actions legible to systems that value continuity over spectacle. When you engage, you do so with terms that protect integrity on both sides. The thaw continues selectively. Certain channels reopen while others remain sealed. This isn't inconsistency, it's discernment. You release only what can be stewarded without dilution. The rest stays preserved, not out of fear, but out of respect for long arcs. You've seen how premature exposure erodes leverage. You won't repeat that lesson. There's a notable change in how people approach you now. Fewer vague offers, more specific asks, less urgency, more preparation. This signals readiness on their side as much as yours. Environments mature when they learn not to rush what matters. You recognize that maturity immediately. It's the difference between appetite and capacity. Internally, you feel a steadier confidence in your timing. You don't need to anticipate the next release. You sense it. Alignment registers as ease without complacency. Resistance registers as information, not obstacle. This keeps your movement accurate even when outcomes remain partially undefined. You're comfortable advancing with incomplete data because your criteria are clear. You might reflect on how patience has reshaped your identity, not as waiting, but as leverage preserved. The freeze taught you how to hold. The thaw teaches you how to place. Placement is where power becomes constructive. It builds rather than burns. It endures rather than spikes. As this phase consolidates, one principle becomes unmistakable. You're no longer adapting to the environment. The environment is adapting to your pace. That doesn't mean control. It means coherence has set the tempo. And coherence, once established, quietly reorganizes everything around it. What comes next isn't an escalation. It's a confirmation that selectivity, once mistaken for delay, was always the strategy. Confirmation doesn't arrive as applause. It arrives as absence of friction. You notice that what once required justification now proceeds without it. Your pace no longer needs defending. Your boundaries no longer need explaining. This is how you know the freeze did more than preserve assets. It recalibrated the environment around them. You may sense that authority is now meeting you horizontally rather than from above. Conversations feel less evaluative and more collaborative. Not because you asserted status, but because you demonstrated reliability under restraint. Systems trust what doesn't overreact. They lean on what remains intact when leverage increases. That trust isn't emotional. It's structural. This is where sovereignty becomes visible, not as dominance, but as independence of timing. You decide when to move, when to wait, and when to decline without consequence. Declining no longer costs you access. It protects it. You've crossed a threshold where scarcity is no longer used against you, because your value isn't tied to immediacy. You may notice that your internal state is remarkably steady even as engagement increases. More visibility doesn't destabilize you. More responsibility doesn't inflate you. This balance is the result of learning power in reverse order. First how to hold it, then how to move it. Most people learn only the second half and collapse under the first test of restraint. You didn't. The symbolic royalty embedded in this story becomes functional here. Royal assets aren't spent to prove legitimacy. Legitimacy is assumed because of stewardship. You don't seek permission to act, and you don't fear delay when alignment isn't present. That independence keeps your decisions clean and your influence durable. There's also a subtle generosity emerging, not of excess but of precision. You give what fits. You share what can be carried. You support without entangling. This generosity doesn't deplete you because it respects boundaries. It strengthens relationships instead of binding them prematurely. As this phase settles, you realize something quietly powerful. The freeze trained you to be unbribable by urgency. Offers no longer pull you out of position. Pressure no longer accelerates you into regret. You move only when the conditions preserve integrity on all sides. That standard filters opportunities better than any strategy ever could. The story continues to narrow, not in scope but in focus. What remains open now is what can endure. Everything else falls away without conflict. And in that narrowing, one final shift approaches. Not a release of assets, but a release of role. Releasing a role doesn't feel like loss. It feels like relief from performance you no longer need. You recognize how many positions you once occupied simply because they were available, not because they were aligned. Mediator. Stabilizer. Silent absorber of chaos. You carried these roles responsibly, but they were provisional. They existed because your assets were frozen and your presence was being used to compensate for instability elsewhere. Now, something changes. You no longer step in automatically. You don't fill gaps that aren't yours. You don't absorb pressure to keep structures intact that refuse to mature. This isn't withdrawal. It's discernment finally catching up to capacity. You understand that staying too long in provisional roles can drain what was preserved for strategic use. You may notice how differently people respond to this shift. Some adjust immediately, respecting the boundary without comment. Others push, testing whether your restraint still includes self-sacrifice. You recognize the test and decline it calmly. You're no longer available as a buffer for systems that won't stabilize themselves. That boundary is one of the clearest signs that the freeze has done its job. As you release roles that were never meant to be permanent, space opens. Not emptiness, capacity. Capacity to engage where alignment is mutual, where responsibility is shared, where leverage isn't extracted from you but exchanged. This is the environment royal assets are meant for. One where your contribution increases value rather than preventing collapse. Internally, there's a noticeable shift in identity. You stop defining yourself by how much you can endure. Endurance was necessary during the freeze. It taught you patience and restraint. But endurance is not the end goal. Stewardship is. And stewardship requires choosing where your strength is applied, not proving that it exists. You may reflect on how often you were praised for being strong in the past. How that praise quietly justified giving you more weight to carry. You accept now that strength without boundaries becomes exploitation, even when it's unintentional. You don't resent this realization. You integrate it. Integration allows you to remain generous without being consumed. This is where your sovereignty becomes unmistakable. You're not reacting to the environment anymore. You're selecting it. Not aggressively. Precisely. You move toward contexts that respect timing, proportion, and accountability. You disengage from those that rely on urgency and improvisation. This isn't elitism. It's accuracy. As roles fall away, something else emerges: clarity of function. You see exactly where your assets belong and where they don't. That clarity feels grounding rather than restrictive. You're no longer carrying the weight of misplacement. Everything you engage now has a reason, a structure, and a future. The freeze protected your asset. The thaw restored movement. Releasing the wrong roles completes the transition. What remains now is not preparation, but positioning. And positioning determines what opens next. Positioning doesn't announce itself with titles or declarations. It reveals itself through fit. You sense when a space can actually hold what you bring without bending it, and when it can't. This awareness isn't judgmental. It's practical. You've learned that misfit creates friction, and friction wastes what was carefully preserved. So you choose environments that meet you at scale, not in appetite. You may notice that conversations feel different now. They're shorter, clearer, more intentional. There's less posturing, less probing. People come prepared. They know what they're asking for. They understand that access to you comes with expectations. Not demands, but standards. This doesn't make you rigid. It makes engagement honest from the start. Honesty is efficient. Internally, there's a new steadiness that doesn't depend on anticipation. You're no longer scanning for the moment when everything unlocks. You understand now that unlocking isn't an event, it's a process. One channel at a time. One responsibility at a time. Each release matched precisely to what can be stewarded without erosion. This keeps momentum clean and prevents overextension. You might feel a subtle shift in how you relate to value. You're less impressed by scale and more attentive to impact density. How much changes relative to how much is spent. This lens simplifies decisions dramatically. Large moves that dilute focus no longer tempt you. Smaller moves that compound over time do. You've learned that durability is built through proportion, not intensity. There's also a noticeable calm in how you hold uncertainty now. You don't need every variable resolved before moving. You need alignment on principles and structure. Everything else can clarify in motion. This confidence doesn't come from optimism, it comes from experience. You've already seen that waiting for perfect conditions is another form of misplacement. You move when the core is sound. As positioning stabilizes, you sense a quiet expansion, not outward but inward. Your range of response widens. You can engage firmly or gently without losing center. You can assert boundaries or offer access without contradiction. This flexibility is not indecision, it's mastery of scale. You're no longer limited to one mode because you're not protecting against collapse anymore. The symbolism of frozen assets reaches its final phase here. What remains frozen stays that way by choice, not restriction. What moves does so with intention, not pressure. You've transitioned from being managed by timing to owning it. That ownership doesn't make you hurried. It makes you exact. Only one movement remains now. Not a new release, but a clear understanding of what all this was for. Not in theory. In practice, the final part doesn't promise revelation. It delivers resolution. Resolution doesn't arrive with a release date or a public signal. It arrives as internal certainty. You recognize that nothing was ever wrong with the pace of your life, only with the comparisons applied to it. What you carried required conditions that didn't exist yet. So the system did what systems designed for longevity do. It preserved, delayed, and protected until alignment replaced urgency. You see now that your assets were never frozen to limit you. They were frozen to prevent misuse, by others and at times by yourself. Power introduced too early teaches dependence on reaction. Power introduced at the right time teaches stewardship. You were taught stewardship first. That order changed everything. This understanding reframes the years that felt stalled. They weren't empty. They were insulating layers. They prevented erosion while you learned how to move without needing to spend yourself. You learned how to wait without shrinking, how to hold capacity without advertising it, how to let weak incentives disqualify themselves. Those lessons don't expire. They compound. There's also clarity now about why certain doors never opened. Not because you weren't qualified, but because opening them would have fragmented your leverage. Some environments needed you available, not committed. Others needed you capable, not exposed. The freeze kept you sovereign while those conditions sorted themselves out. Sovereignty was the real inheritance. You're no longer looking for permission to move. You're not waiting for confirmation that the thaw is complete. You can feel it in how decisions land, how boundaries hold, how engagement no longer costs you clarity. You're operating from ownership rather than anticipation. That shift is irreversible. If there is inspiration here, it's grounded rather than aspirational. You don't need to accelerate. You don't need to announce. You don't need to recover lost time. Nothing was lost. What matters now is continuation with precision. Moving what fits, holding what doesn't, letting alignment dictate pace. The story closes not with release, but with command of timing. You understand what to protect, what to deploy, and when to do nothing at all. That triad, protect, deploy, withhold, is the signature of true stewardship. Your assets were frozen on purpose, so they could be released without consequence, and now they are no longer frozen. They are yours.